Bumpy Johnson knew he was dying. The chest pains had been getting worse for weeks. July 6, 1968, he woke up knowing it might be his last day. But he went to Wells' restaurant anyway. Same table, same breakfast. Because the Genovese family had sent word. They wanted a meeting about heroin, about Harlem's future, about what happens when the king dies. Bumpy could have stayed home, spent his last hours in peace. Instead, he sat across from 3 mob enforcers and made a choice. Protect his legacy or protect his life. He couldn't do both. He chose Harlem. If you walked through Harlem in the summer of 1968, you'd see something dying. Not the buildings, not the music, not the people, but the soul. Heroin was creeping into the streets like poison gas, and everyone knew where it was coming from. The Italian mob, specifically the Genovese crime family. For 30 years, Bumpy Johnson had kept that poison out. He ran the numbers, controlled the gambling, kept the peace between the Irish, the Italians, and his own people. But he had one rule that never bent: no heroin in Harlem. Not in his neighborhood, not while he was breathing. But in 1968, Bumpy Johnson wasn't breathing so well anymore. He was 62 years old. His heart was failing. The doctors at Harlem Hospital had told him 6 months ago, "Slow down, retire, enjoy what time you have left." Bumpy had laughed. Retire? A man like him didn't retire. He died working. And if he was going to die, he was going to die on his feet, not in some hospital bed. The Genovese family knew this. They'd been watching him, waiting. Vito Genovese himself was locked up in federal prison in Atlanta, dying of a heart condition just like Bumpy. But his family was still powerful, still hungry, and they saw an opportunity. Harlem without Bumpy Johnson. That was an open market, a gold mine waiting to be claimed. The young soldiers, the ones who didn't remember when Bumpy had walked into Lucky Luciano's office unarmed in 1935 and walked out alive. They thought it would be easy. Just wait for the old man to die, then move in. Set up heroin distribution networks. Take over the numbers racket. Turn Harlem into another profit center. But the older bosses, the ones who remembered, they knew better. They knew Bumpy Johnson was more dangerous dying than most men were in their prime. They knew you didn't just walk into Harlem and take what you wanted. Not while Bumpy was alive. So they decided to try negotiation first. Make him an offer. Appeal to his business sense. After all, he was old, sick, dying. Surely he'd want to secure his family's future. Surely he'd want to go out with one last payday. On July 6, 1968, 3 men in expensive suits got into a black Cadillac in Little Italy and drove uptown to Harlem. Their names were Anthony Tony Peels Lentini, Joseph Joey Surprise, Stacy, and a young soldier named Paulie Fortunato. They were armed. They were connected. And Joey Surprise was carrying a black leather briefcase containing $100,000 in cash. They had no idea they were driving to their own humiliation. Wells' restaurant sat on the corner of 32nd Street and 7th Avenue. It wasn't fancy. Red leather boots worn smooth by decades of use. Black and white checkered floor. The smell of bacon grease and coffee that had been brewing since dawn. The walls were covered with photographs of Harlem legends, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., and in the corner, a framed photo of Bumpy Johnson himself shaking hands with Muhammad Ali. But it was Bumpy's place. His table was in the back corner, facing the door, always facing the door. Old habit from the days when enemies came through doors, not with contracts, but with guns. That morning, Bumpy was alone. His wife, Mame, had begged him not to go. She'd felt something in the air, the way women who've lived with dangerous men learn to feel danger before it arrives. But Bumpy had kissed her forehead, straightened his tie, and told her he'd be home by noon. He always wore a suit, even for breakfast. Respect, he'd say. Respect yourself, respect others. He ordered his usual scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, wheat toast, black coffee. He was reading the Amsterdam News, Harlem's black newspaper, an article about the garbage workers' strike, when the restaurant door opened and those 3 men walked in. The entire restaurant went quiet. Not the sudden silence of shock, but the gradual dimming of conversation as people recognized what was happening. The waitress, a woman named Dorothy who'd been working at Wells for 20 years, stopped mid-pour. Her hand trembled slightly, coffee splashing onto the counter. Everyone in Harlem knew what Italian suits in a black neighborhood meant. Business, the kind that usually ended badly for somebody. Bumpy didn't look up from his newspaper. He took a slow sip of coffee, turned the page with deliberate calm, and waited. He'd been expecting this. Word travels fast in both worlds, and he'd known the Genovese family was looking to make a move. He'd known they'd send someone eventually. He just hadn't known it would be today. Tony Peels walked over first. He was the talker, the negotiator, a capo in his mid-40s, who'd made his bones running bookmaking operations in the Bronx. Joey's surprise stayed by the door, blocking it, his eyes scanning the restaurant for threats. The black leather briefcase hung heavy in his hand. Paulie, the young one, barely 25, stood behind Tony, trying to look hard, trying to look like he belonged in the same room as Bumpy Johnson. "Mr. Johnson," Tony said, his voice respectful but firm. "Mind if we sit?" Bumpy folded his newspaper slowly, deliberately taking his time. He looked up at Tony with those cold, calculating eyes that had stared down mob bosses, crooked cops, and killers for 30 years. Eyes that had seen men die and never blinked. Then he gestured to the booth across from him. "Free country." The three men slid into the booth. Dorothy came over, her hands shaking slightly, and asked if they wanted coffee. Tony waved her away without looking at her. This wasn't a social call. This was business. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds in Wells' restaurant were the sizzle of bacon on the griddle, the low hum of whispered conversation from other tables, and the tick of the old Coca-Cola clock on the wall. Everyone in the restaurant was watching, pretending not to watch. Across the street in a parked Buick, two of Bumpy's men sat watching through the window. Big Jack Turner and Raymond Slim Washington. They'd been there since 6003 that morning, drinking cold coffee and waiting. Bumpy never went anywhere without backup. Not in 1968. Not with the streets getting dangerous, the young punks getting bold, the old rules breaking down. Tony Peels broke the silence. He nodded to Joey's surprise, who stepped forward from his position by the door. Joey placed the black leather briefcase on the table between Bumpy and Tony, right next to Bumpy's coffee cup. The kind of briefcases bankers carried, the kind serious money traveled in. The metallic latches clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet restaurant. Inside, stacked neatly and bundles secured with bank straps, were 100 bills. A lot of them. The money was real, visible, tempting. "Mr. Johnson," Tony said, his voice lowering to that confidential tone businessmen use when they're about to propose something they know is wrong but profitable. "We come with respect, with a business proposition that I think you'll find very generous." Bumpy didn't touch the briefcase, didn't even look inside it. His eyes stayed locked on Tony's face. "I'm listening." Tony Peels leaned forward, his hands folded on the table away from the open briefcase. "The world is changing, Mr. Johnson. You know this better than anyone. The young people, they don't want numbers anymore. They don't want policy slips and betting pools. They want something stronger. Something that makes them forget about Vietnam, forget about poverty, forget about everything. They want heroin." Bumpy's expression didn't change. He took another sip of coffee, his hands steady. Tony continued, gesturing to the open briefcase. "Now, whether you like it or not, it's coming to Harlem. The demand is there. The supply routes are established. We've got connections in Marseille, in Turkey." Tony Peels leaned forward, his hands folded on the table away from the open briefcase. "The world is changing, Mr. Johnson. You know this better than anyone. The young people, they don't want numbers anymore. They don't want policy slips and betting pools. They want something stronger. Something that makes them forget about Vietnam, forget about poverty, forget about everything. They want heroin." Bumpy's expression didn't change. He took another sip of coffee, his hands steady. Tony continued, gesturing to the open briefcase. "Now, whether you like it or not, it's coming to Harlem. The demand is there. The supply routes are established. We've got connections in Marseille, in Turkey, in Southeast Asia. The product is going to flow. The only question is who controls it." He gestured to the stacks of bills. "This is $100,000 in cash, tax-free, untraceable, and it's just the down payment. We're offering you 30% of all heroin profits in Harlem. You don't have to do anything, don't have to distribute, don't have to take any risk. Just stop blocking us. Let us operate. You keep your territory, we keep ours. Everybody eats." The briefcase sat there on the table between them, bills visible in neat stacks, bank straps holding them together. Bumpy could see the denomination on the top bills. Hundreds. Real money. Serious money. A fortune. Enough to take care of Mai for the rest of her life. Enough to buy property, invest, leave a legacy beyond the streets. Enough to die comfortable. But Bumpy Johnson had never cared about dying comfortable. Polly, the young one, couldn't keep his mouth shut. Youth and arrogance, Bumpy thought. A dangerous combination. Mr. Johnson, with all respect, you're not a young man anymore. You've had a good run, 30 years at the top. That's more than most men get. Why fight this? Take the money. Enjoy your time. Live to see your grandchildren grow up. We're going to do this with or without you. This is just us showing respect to a legend. That's when Bumpy's eyes shifted from Tony to Polly, and the temperature in that booth dropped 10 degrees. Dorothy, refilling water glasses, 3 tables away, felt it. The other customers felt it. Even Tony Peels felt it, and he reached out to put a hand on Polly's arm. Too late. How old are you, son? Bumpy's voice was quiet, conversational. Polly straightened up, trying to look tough, trying not to show that Bumpy's stare was making his stomach clench. 25. 25. Bumpy nodded slowly as if considering this. You know how old I was when I walked into Lucky Luciano's office in Manhattan and told him he couldn't touch Harlem without my permission? Polly didn't answer, didn't know the answer. 29, 4 years older than you. You know what Lucky told me? He said I was crazy, said I was a dead man walking, said his organization would crush me like a bug. That was 1935, 33 years ago. Bumpy paused. And here I am, still breathing, still in Harlem. And Lucky died in Italy in exile in 1962. Heart attack just like the one that's going to kill me. He looked back at Tony. Where's Vito Genovese right now, Tony? Tony Peels shifted uncomfortably. He's in federal prison, Mr. Johnson. You know that. Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Heart disease, just like me. Dying, same as me. Dying, same as me. Bumpy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Funny how that works. We spend our whole lives fighting each other, and in the end, it's our own hearts that kill us. Tony tried to regain control of the conversation. Mr. Johnson, nobody's disrespecting you. We know your history, we know what you've built, but times change. The old ways, the old codes, they don't. The old ways. Bumpy's voice was quiet, but it cut like a straight razor. You think you're offering me something new? You think I haven't seen this before? Heroin isn't new, Tony. It's been knocking on Harlem's door since the 20s, after World War I, then again after World War II. And every single time I slammed that door shut. You know why? Tony didn't answer. Because I've seen what it does. I watched it destroy Chinatown in the 30s. I watched it hollow out neighborhoods in Chicago. I watched it turn human beings into walking corpses. And I made a promise to this community that as long as I was breathing, that poison wouldn't flow freely through Harlem. He reached across the table and closed the briefcase. The latches clicked shut with finality. Then he pushed the briefcase back toward Tony, sliding it across the table. The scraping sound echoed in the silent restaurant. I don't want your money and I don't want your poison in my neighborhood. Joey Surprise spoke up from his position near the door, his voice harder than Tony's. Bumpy, be reasonable. You can't stop this. You're one man. We're an organization. We've got muscle connections, politicians on our payroll. What do you have? A few old numbers, runners, and a reputation. Bumpy looked at Joey, then back at Tony, then at young Polly. And for the first time since they'd sat down, he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, it wasn't friendly, it was the smile of a man who'd seen death before and wasn't afraid of it. The smile of a man who'd made his peace. Let me tell you something about Harlem, Bumpy said, his voice steady and strong, despite the tightness beginning to build in his chest. You think it's just another neighborhood, just another market to exploit, just another revenue stream? He shook his head slowly. Harlem is a promise to the people who built it with their bare hands. A promise to the people who came up from the South looking for freedom and found it here. A promise to the kids growing up in these streets that there's another way besides crime, besides drugs, besides destroying yourself to make white men in downtown offices rich. He pointed at the closed briefcase. You bring that garbage into Harlem, you're not just selling drugs. You're selling death. You're selling hopelessness. You're taking young men who could be doctors, lawyers, teachers, leaders, men who could change the world, and you're turning them into addicts and corpses. Tony Peels shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Johnson, we're businessmen. We're not responsible for what people choose to your murderers. Bumpy's voice didn't rise, but somehow it filled the entire room. Dorothy dropped a spoon behind the counter. The clatter echoed like a gunshot. Don't dress it up with words like business and choice. You're murderers. You sell poison. You destroy families. You kill communities. And you want me to shake your hand and help you do it? The pain in his chest was starting now. Bumpy could feel it, a tightness, a pressure, like someone was slowly tightening a vice around his heart. His left arm was tingling. He recognized the signs. He'd seen men die of heart attacks before. His own father had died this way, clutching his chest in a cotton field in South Carolina in 1922. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't done talking yet. "Here's my answer to your proposition," Bumpy said, looking each man in the eye. First Tony, then Joey, then young Paulie, who couldn't hold his gaze and looked away. "You can bring your heroin to Harlem over my dead body. And even then, the people I've taught, the lessons I've lived, they'll fight you every step of the way. You'll never control Harlem. Not the way you control Little Italy or the Bronx. Not while there's one person left who remembers what I stood for." The pain was getting worse now, sharper. His breathing was becoming difficult. But Bumpy Johnson had one more thing to say. 7 words that would be repeated in Harlem for the next 50 years. 7 words that would become his epitaph. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Tony Peel's, and said, "Harlem doesn't bow. Not now. Not ever." The pain hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. Bumpy's hand flew to his heart, gripping his shirt. His coffee cup slipped from his other hand and shattered on the floor, black liquid spreading across the checkered tiles like blood. Dorothy screamed from behind the counter. "Oh God, somebody call an ambulance." But before anyone could move, the restaurant door burst open with a crash. 4 men walked in, big men, Harlem men. Big Jack Turner led them, his 6'4" frame filling the doorway. Behind him came Raymond Slim Washington, Marcus the Deacon Williams, and a young enforcer named Cleveland, who worked security for Bumpy's policy banks. They'd been watching from across the street the whole time. They'd seen the Italians walk in. They'd been waiting, ready, and when they saw Bumpy grab his chest through the window, they came running. Big Jack's eyes went from Bumpy clutching his chest, gasping for air, to the 3 Italians sitting across from him in the booth, to the black briefcase on the table between them. "What did you do to him?" Big Jack's voice was pure ice, pure murder. Tony Peel's went pale. His hands came up instinctively, showing he was unarmed, showing he meant no harm. "Nothing. We were just talking. We were just." He just grabs his chest. "I swear to God, we didn't. You brought poison to his table." Big Jack stepped closer, his massive hands flexing into fists. "You disrespected him in his own neighborhood, and now he's dying right in front of you." That's when Tony Peel's understood, and so did Joey Surprise, and so did young Paulie, whose face had gone from cocky to terrified in about 3 seconds. It didn't matter what actually happened. It didn't matter that Bumpy was 62 years old with a failing heart. And this was probably going to happen today, whether they showed up or not. What mattered was perception. What mattered was what it looked like. 3 Italian mobsters sitting across from Bumpy Johnson when he has a heart attack in Harlem, with witnesses in a neighborhood that loved him like a father. They'd be torn apart before the ambulance arrived. Joey's Surprise was already backing toward the door, the briefcase still in his hand. Paulie's hand started to go toward his jacket, toward his gun. But Big Jack caught his wrist in a grip like a steel trap. "You pull that gun, boy, and you'll never leave this neighborhood. None of you will. There'll be 3 bodies floating in the East River by sunset." Through his pain, through the vice crushing his chest, through the difficulty breathing, Bumpy managed to speak. His voice was barely a whisper. But in the terrified silence of Wells' restaurant, everyone heard it. "Let them go." Big Jack looked down at him, confused, angry. "Boss, let them go." Bumpy's breathing was ragged now, each word a struggle. "I want them to tell their bosses." He looked directly at Tony Peel's, who was frozen in the booth, too scared to move, too scared to stay. "Tell them Harlem doesn't bow." Big Jack released Paulie's wrist. He stepped back, creating a path to the door, but his eyes promised violence if they ever came back. Tony Peel's grabbed the briefcase from the table. Evidence, witness, problem. And the 3 Italians didn't walk. They ran. Joey clutching the briefcase. Paulie and Tony right behind them. Out the door into their Cadillac. Tires squealing as they burned rubber. Of getting out of Harlem. They weren't running from Bumpy. They were running from the rage of an entire neighborhood. From the knowledge that if Bumpy Johnson died with them in the room, they'd be blamed, and Harlem would come for them. Every street corner, every alley, every rooftop, there'd be nowhere safe. Better to run, better to disappear. Behind them in Wells' restaurant, Dorothy was at Bumpy's side now, holding his hand, tears streaming down her face. Big Jack was yelling for someone to call the hospital. Other customers were gathering around, some crying, some praying. Bumpy looked up at Dorothy and managed to smile. A real smile this time, soft and genuine. "Tell Mai," he whispered. "Tell her I'm sorry I missed lunch." Those were his last words. At 8:52 a.m. on July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson's heart gave out. 5 minutes after the meeting with the Genovese family representatives. 5 minutes after he said no to 100,000. 5 minutes after he chose principle over survival. He died sitting in his booth at Wells' restaurant, the same place he'd eaten breakfast every Saturday morning for 20 years. He died surrounded by his community, by people who knew him, respected him, loved him. He died free, unbought, unbowed. The funeral was 5 days later at Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street. More than 5,000 people came to pay their respects. The line stretched for 6 blocks down 7th Avenue. People who'd never met Bumpy, people who'd only heard the stories, people whose parents had told them about the man who'd kept Harlem safe. They all came to say goodbye. The Italian mob, true to form, tried to move in after Bumpy's death. For about 6 months, they pushed heroin into Harlem, thinking the king was dead and the throne was empty. They were wrong. The old guard, the numbers runners who'd worked with Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy since the 1930s, the local operators who remembered the codes, the street-level organizers who'd learned from watching Bumpy navigate between legitimacy and the underworld. They remembered what Bumpy had stood for. They remembered his words, "Harlem doesn't bow." But the truth is painful and history demands honesty. Bumpy's death did create a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Within a few years, younger hustlers who didn't remember Bumpy's rules, who hadn't sat at his knee and learned the difference between taking what you need and destroying your own community, they did start bringing heroin into Harlem in larger quantities. They told themselves they were different. They told themselves they were smarter. They told themselves they could control it, could contain it, could profit from it without destroying the neighborhood. They were wrong. The heroin epidemic that Bumpy died fighting came anyway. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, Harlem suffered. Families were destroyed. Young men and women became addicts. The very nightmare Bumpy had tried to prevent became reality. But here's what the history books miss. What the statistics don't capture. It was harder because of Bumpy. The Italian mob never fully controlled Harlem the way they controlled Little Italy, the Bronx, or parts of Brooklyn. Local operators retained some autonomy. The community remembered there was another way, even if they couldn't always live it. And when the worst of the epidemic hit, when crack cocaine came in the 1980s, there were still people in Harlem who remembered Bumpy Johnson's stand. They invoked his name. They reminded the young people, once we had a man who said no. Once we had a king who chose principle over profit. Once we had a leader who'd rather die than betray his community. That memory mattered. It still matters. Tony Peels kept that black leather briefcase for the rest of his life. Never opened it again after that day. Never deposited the money. Never spent a single dollar. The H-100,000 was still inside exactly as it had been stacked that morning. Same bank straps, same bundles, untouched. He kept it in a safe in his basement in Queens. And occasionally, when young mobsters would come to him for advice, for wisdom, for stories about the old days, he'd take out that briefcase, open it, and show them the money. This, he'd say, pointing to the neat stacks of bills, is what happens when you disrespect a king. This is what happens when you think money can buy everything. Bumpy Johnson was dying. We offered him a fortune, and he chose to die rather than take it. He'd close the briefcase and lock it back in the safe. That's honor. That's principle. That's something we've forgotten how to do. Tony Peels died in 1987 of lung cancer. His son, Anthony Jr., found the briefcase in the basement safe after the funeral. He opened it, saw the money, still there, still bundled, bills yellowed with age but intact, and found a handwritten note tucked inside. Give this to the Schomburg Center in Harlem. It belongs to them, not to us. Let them know it's the money Bumpy Johnson refused. The money that proved he couldn't be bought, TP. The briefcase and its contents were allegedly donated anonymously to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in 1988. The museum won't officially confirm its existence, but curators who've been there for decades will quietly tell you. Somewhere in the archives, there's a black leather briefcase with 100,000 in 1968 bills. A memorial to the day a dying man said no. Wells Restaurant closed in 1982. A victim of changing neighborhoods and rising rents. Before they tore the building down to make way for a parking garage, a group of Harlem residents commissioned a small brass plaque. They installed it on the wall where Bumpy's booth used to be right before the wrecking crew arrived. It stayed there for exactly 1 day before the building came down. But someone took a photograph, and that photograph circulated through Harlem, and the words on that plaque were repeated, memorized, passed down. It read, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 1905-1968, the man who never bowed. In this place, he chose honor over life. Today, if you walk through Harlem, you'll still hear his name. Old-timers sitting on stoops, playing dominoes, drinking coffee. They tell stories about the time Bumpy faced down Lucky Luciano and walked out alive. About the time he stopped a riot with a single gesture. About the morning he sat across from the Italian mob and said no with his dying breath. The stories aren't always accurate. Details get mixed up. Timelines get confused. Legends blend with facts. But the essence remains true. Once Harlem had a king who couldn't be bought. Once a man chose his community over his comfort. Once someone showed the world that some things matter more than money, more than power, more than life itself. That's Bumpy Johnson's legacy. Not the gambling, not the violence, not the criminal empire. The moment when he had to choose between surviving a few more months in comfort or dying on his principles. He chose to die standing up. And in doing so, he showed Harlem, showed all of us what real strength looks like. Not the strength to hurt people, not the strength to accumulate wealth, but the strength to say no when everyone expects you to say yes. The strength to choose the hard right over the easy wrong. The strength to be a man of principle in a world that rewards compromise. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson's heart stopped beating, but his words kept echoing. Harlem doesn't bow, not now, not ever. And 56 years later, those words still mean something. They still inspire. They still remind us that we have choices, that we have agency, that we don't have to accept the world as it is. We can be like Bumpy. We can stand up. We can say no. We can choose principle over survival, even if it costs us everything. If this story of courage and unshakable principle moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear that honor still matters in a world that's forgotten what it means. Drop a comment below. Would you have made the same choice Bumpy did? Let us know and turn on notifications for more untold stories of Harlem's greatest legends.